At dawn, Arthur Vale stood near Hangar 12 with an old blue toolbox at his feet. His old tools made them doubt him.
We will continue without your advice.
To Arthur, the aircraft was already telling a different story.
The right side sounds different.
Arthur trusted the sound. He had heard that pattern before.
They missed the first sign.
Hidden beneath the calm rhythm of metal and engines. Mara Ellison noticed what the others ignored.
What did you hear?
Arthur was not guessing. He was listening.
The pulse comes first.
Then he heard it again. A small change. A familiar rhythm.
There. That is the sound.
A warning no screen had explained yet. And before anyone understood why that brass mirror mattered, the moment had already become the beginning of the truth. Only later would that mirror matter. Later, people would understand what that moment meant. They would see the billionaire stepping over the old mechanic's mirror and recognize the cruelty in it instantly. They would understand that Julian Mercer had not only stepped over a tool, he had stepped over experience, warning, poverty, and truth. But at that moment, outside the fence of Hangar 12, nobody saw the symbol. They only saw an old man being dragged away from an aircraft he had no permission to touch. The only person who did not laugh was Mara Ellison. Mara was not an engineer or a mechanic. She was an operations coordinator, the kind of employee important men rarely noticed until something went wrong. She handled access badges, schedules, vendor records, inspection rooms, maintenance logs, and all the quiet details that allowed Mercer Aerotech to look organized from the outside. She had worked there for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between a company that talked about safety and a company that truly listened to warnings. And the look on Arthur Vale's face bothered her. He did not look like a confused old man. He did not look like someone trying to cause trouble. He looked like a man who had heard danger before anyone else recognized it. Even after Julian humiliated him, even after the guards dragged him away and his tools scattered across the concrete, Arthur kept looking past the people and toward the aircraft. That was what Mara could not forget. Most people, when insulted that publicly, would stare at the person who hurt them. Arthur looked at the machine. After security left him near the service road, Mara found him kneeling beside the curb, placing his tools back into the dented blue box one by one. He did not seem surprised when she approached. Men who spend their lives around failing machines often know when something is coming before it arrives. She asked how he knew about the right wing. Arthur did not give her a resume. He did not defend his pride. He only explained what he had heard. The engine note was clean, he said, but beneath it there had been a second rhythm, a small pulsing tremor that did not match fan speed, hydraulic cycling, or actuator movement. When the warnings appeared, they appeared in the wrong order for a software fault. Something physical was lying to the control system before the control system began protecting itself. Mara had listened to expensive consultants talk for 3 weeks. They used larger words than Arthur, but Arthur made more sense. Then she asked what would happen if Julian ran the test again. Arthur looked toward the hangar and said the aircraft would probably shut itself down again. But the repeated false response could begin stressing a secondary hydraulic isolation valve. If Mercer replaced that valve afterward, without finding the original source, the jet might pass one clean test and still carry the hidden fault into the air. That answer frightened Mara because it did not sound dramatic. It sounded practical. Inside the hangar, Julian was already demanding another run. Mara had a choice. She could return to her desk. She could tell herself she was not qualified, not responsible, and not brave enough to risk her job for a stranger. She could do what people inside large companies learn to do when instinct warns them, but their paycheck tells them to stay quiet. She could wait until the failure became undeniable and then claim she had never known enough to act. But silence, she had learned, was not neutral. Sometimes silence was only obedience wearing a safer name. So she brought Arthur back in. She did not make a scene. She used an old parts corridor, a canceled vendor badge, and a maintenance observation room no executive had visited in months. Arthur clipped the borrowed badge to his old jacket without even reading the name. He had spent most of his life in places where the label on a person's chest mattered less than whether that person could hear when a machine was in trouble. From the observation room above the hangar floor, Arthur watched the next test begin. Below them, the Meridian X7 came alive again. Dr. Evan Rusk, Mercer Aerotech's Vice President of Advanced Systems, stood near the main diagnostic station with the calm posture of a man who believed every room belonged to him. Rusk was not foolish, and that made him dangerous. For 3 weeks, he had guided the investigation towards software anomalies, supplier defects, and isolated sensor failures. He had dismissed early concerns about vibration near the right-wing route, not by destroying them, but by burying them under categories that made them look unimportant. Arthur did not know all of that yet, but he knew the type. Aviation had always had men who believed truth could be managed politically. They treated machines as if machines cared about schedules, investors, reputations, or titles. But aircraft do not care about any of those things. A hidden fault does not become safer because a billionaire needs a demonstration flight. Sooner or later, the machine demands payment. As the engines rose, Arthur placed one hand lightly against the metal frame of the observation window. He was too far from the aircraft to diagnose by touch, but vibration travels through structures in patterns most people never notice. Mara watched his face. His eyes narrowed before the first alarm appeared. He knew before the screens knew. Then the warnings returned. This time, a new message appeared beneath the others. The secondary hydraulic isolation response had delayed. Mara felt the air leave her lungs. Arthur had predicted it. On the hangar floor, Rusk immediately recommended replacing the hydraulic isolation valve and related module. It sounded decisive. It sounded expensive. It sounded like progress. But Arthur's expression tightened. To him, the new warning was not the cause. It was only the bruise left by the original injury. He asked Mara for the maintenance records from the last major modification near the right wing. Mara hesitated only once. Then she opened the files. 6 months earlier, the Meridian X7 had undergone a luxury cabin refit, acoustic upgrades, environmental system changes, and structural access work near the wing carry-through. The work had been finished ahead of schedule. Every inspection box had initials. Every approval line looked clean. Too clean. Arthur searched not for what was written, but for what should have been written and was missing. He saw vague language where precise torque confirmation should have appeared. He saw a late-night sign-off from a technician ID used on overlapping work. He saw a photo attachment briefly flagged as non-conforming, then marked resolved. When the photo opened, Mara thought it looked ordinary. Arthur did not. The image showed a vibration-dampening bracket near the lower right wing root. Beneath one edge sat a thin shim, a spacer inserted where the bracket should have seated flush. To a casual eye, it was almost invisible. To Arthur, it was the kind of shortcut that turns a small alignment issue into a hidden amplifier. Under light load, the assembly would behave. under rising thrust, vibration could travel through the shim, reach the nearby control feedback harness, and create a false stabilizer signal. The computer would believe the aircraft's tail surface had moved when it had not. The hydraulic system would try to correct a lie. The correction would create pressure disturbances and thermal echoes. The screens would show unrelated warnings because the aircraft was reporting symptoms from a hidden cause. The experts had been chasing ghosts. Arthur had found the grave. Then he saw the reference number attached to the retrofit kit, and his hand went still. Project Larkspur. Mara noticed the change in him immediately. Until that moment, Arthur had been focused, tired, and steady. Now something old moved behind his eyes, something heavier than a technical problem. Project Larkspur was not just a design file, it was a wound. 16 years earlier, Arthur Vale had been one of the best practical maintenance minds in an experimental aviation program, studying vibration and control feedback. He did not have the highest degree in the room, but he often found the fault first. He could hear a bearing starting to fail before a sensor trend caught it. He could feel through a wrench when a bracket was seating wrong. Back then, people listened. Then a prototype aircraft suffered a serious control anomaly during a storm approach. The official investigation blamed improper maintenance oversight. Arthur was the senior mechanic on paper, and paper mattered more than truth when frightened executives needed a simple conclusion. He lost his certification, his job, his reputation, and eventually the house he had shared with his wife, Evelyn. He tried to appeal, but records went missing. Raw data was withheld, and legal letters arrived faster than hope. When Evelyn became ill, he chose medicine over lawyers. After she died, the last person who fully believed him was gone. For 16 years, Arthur lived as the man officially blamed. Now the same family of vibration control ideas had returned inside Mercer's flagship jet, carrying the same kind of warning he had once tried to explain. Mara did not know the whole story, but she could feel its weight. She printed the inspection photo before the system locked the record again. Arthur took the brass mirror from his toolbox and wiped it with his sleeve. Then he told her they needed to open the right-wing panel before Rusk replaced the hydraulic module and buried the evidence beneath a false repair. Getting to the aircraft was easier than it should have been. In large companies, everyone assumes someone else has checked the person walking with purpose. Mara carried a clipboard. Arthur carried a toolbox. Together, they looked official enough to cross half the hangar before anyone questioned them. At the right-wing root, Arthur knelt with effort. His knee stiffened badly, but he did not complain. Pain had become background noise long ago. He loosened the panel fasteners and angled the brass mirror into the narrow space behind the structure. There it was, the shim. The bracket showed faint fretting marks where vibration had worked against the support. The nearby control feedback harness had a polished gray shine along its outer insulation. Not cut, not failed, but rubbed and compressed by repeated contact. It was exactly the kind of damage that could escape a standard continuity test and still corrupt a signal under load. Arthur did not celebrate being right. Good mechanics do not celebrate danger. Then Dr. Evan Rusk saw him. At first, Rusk did not shout. He did not need to. His body simply went still near the diagnostic station. His eyes fixed on the open panel, on the old man kneeling beside the right-wing root, on the brass mirror angled into the dark space where no unauthorized person was supposed to look. For one brief second, the calm professional mask slipped from his face. What appeared beneath it was not confusion. It was fear. Julian Mercer followed Rusk's gaze and turned toward the right wing. His expression changed so quickly that several mechanics stepped back before he even spoke. Less than an hour earlier, Julian had ordered the old man dragged away from the fence. Now that same old man was inside the hangar, beside the flagship aircraft, holding the kind of evidence that could turn an engineering failure into a corporate scandal. Julian crossed the hangar floor with security behind him. He accused Arthur of trespassing. He accused Mara of violating restricted access. He accused the mechanics nearby of allowing a dangerous breach near a multi-million-dollar aircraft. He did not ask what Arthur had found. He did not look into the open panel. He only understood one thing. A man he had humiliated was now standing too close to the truth. Arthur rose slowly. His knee made the movement difficult, and the hangar saw that too. He did not look powerful. He looked like an old mechanic who had spent too many years carrying pain quietly. But behind him, the open panel spoke louder than status. The shim was there. The rubbed harness was there. The fretting on the bracket was there. The aircraft had hidden the answer in plain structure, and Arthur had found it. Rusk stepped in with careful timing. He did not deny the shim. That would have sounded defensive. Instead, he framed the discovery as contaminated. Arthur had no active certification, no authorization, and no chain of custody protection. Once an unauthorized outsider opened the panel, Rusk said, no one could know whether the harness had been disturbed or whether any evidence inside could be trusted. Then he used the word that made the hangar colder. Sabotage. He did not say Arthur had done it. He only said the company had to consider the possibility. A disgraced former mechanic with a personal history involving aircraft control failures had entered the facility under false credentials and accessed a critical system area. The sentence was polished, cautious, and poisonous. A broken aircraft was complicated. A saboteur was easy. Mara felt the room shift. She understood what Rusk was doing. He was not trying to prove Arthur wrong. He was trying to make Arthur unusable. If Arthur became a contamination risk, the evidence could be delayed. If he became a possible saboteur, his warning could become motive. If Mara became the employee who let him in, her concern could be framed as recklessness instead of courage. Arthur had seen this kind of burial before. 16 years earlier, the words had been different, but the shape was the same. Improper maintenance oversight, failure to verify, inadequate detection, terms clean enough for reports, heavy enough to crush a life. Back then, men in quiet rooms had taken a complicated failure and arranged it until it pointed at the person least able to fight back. But this time, Arthur was not alone outside the fence. Cal Benton, an older Mercer mechanic, stepped closer to the open panel. He looked at the shim, then at the harness, then at Rusk. Cal had worked around aircraft too long to pretend the old man had invented what they were seeing. He had laughed earlier, not because Arthur was funny, but because fear and exhaustion had made him weak. Now he had seen enough. Cal said the panel should be photographed as found and tested before anything was replaced. Arthur's theory could be checked safely, without running the engines. A controlled vibration trace at the wing root, while monitoring the feedback harness and hydraulic response, would show the order clearly. If Arthur was wrong, the data would clear the concern. If he was right, the false signal would appear before the hydraulic dip. Rusk rejected the test too quickly. That was his mistake. In a technical room, speed can reveal fear. Another mechanic said the test would take less than 15 minutes. A younger technician admitted that vibration near the right wing root had been mentioned during the first week, but the concern had been redirected towards software. Someone else remembered an inspection note that disappeared from the active troubleshooting package after Rusk reviewed it. Truth entered the hangar trembling, but it entered. Julian sensed control slipping away. He hated it. But there were too many witnesses now. Too many eyes on the open panel. Too many mechanics beginning to understand that the old man had found the physical origin of a failure their screens had only translated into symptoms. If Julian refused the test, it would look like fear. So he allowed it, but only after warning that when the test proved nothing, Arthur would be removed, Mara would face consequences, and the company would treat the breach with full seriousness. Arthur did not react. He stepped back and let licensed Mercer technicians place the sensors. That mattered. He did not need to touch anything else. He had already shown them where to look. Now the machine itself would speak. The vibration unit was attached near the right wing root. The feedback harness was monitored. The hydraulic isolation response was tracked. The main screen displayed all 3 traces in sequence. Rusk stood near the diagnostic station, his arms folded, his face professionally blank. Julian stood beside him, ready to turn the old man's failure into a lesson for everyone watching. Mara remained near the tool cart, holding the printed inspection photo like a fragile shield. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The traces stayed calm. A few executives near the glass offices exchanged looks, already preparing to believe this had all been an embarrassing waste of time. Rusk's posture loosened by a fraction. Julian's mouth tightened into the beginning of satisfaction. Then the frequency increased. A small ripple appeared on the feedback line. It was subtle, almost nothing. The kind of signal that would have been dismissed as noise if no one had known to watch for it. But Arthur's eyes did not leave the screen. The ripple sharpened. The stabilizer feedback channel flickered, showing a disagreement that lasted barely long enough to register. 3 seconds later, the hydraulic isolation response delayed. Then the same chain of ghost warnings began to form in miniature. The order was undeniable. The false stabilizer signal came first. The hydraulic dip came second. The thermal spike came third. The room went silent. It was not the silence of confusion anymore. It was the silence of a lie losing protection. The aircraft had repeated Arthur's theory in front of the people who tried to mock it out of existence. The computer hadn't failed first. The hydraulic system hadn't failed first. The software had not invented the problem. The first wrongness came from the area Arthur had named while standing outside the fence. Julian stared at the data as if wealth could make numbers rearrange themselves. Rusk recovered faster. He said the result was interesting, but not conclusive. It still did not prove when the shim was installed. It did not prove the harness condition existed before Arthur opened the panel. He tried to pull the room back into uncertainty, back into procedure, back into fog. Then Mara placed the archived inspection photo onto the main screen. The same bracket appeared, the same shim, the same harness routed too close. The timestamp was 6 months old. Arthur could not have planted a shim 6 months before he entered the hangar. He could not have damaged a harness in a photograph taken long before anyone knew his name. He could not have invented the sequence that the vibration trace had just reproduced. The sabotage theory collapsed under the cold simplicity of time. Then Mara enlarged the approval section of the file. The final sign-off belonged to Dr. Evan Rusk. A low murmur moved through the hangar. It did not become loud. It did not need to. Everyone understood what they were seeing. The man who had dismissed the vibration notes redirected the investigation accused Arthur of contamination, and recommended replacing the wrong module, had also approved the refit record containing the very shortcut now exposed in the right wing. Rusk's face lost color. Julian turned toward him, not with moral outrage, but with the fury of a man discovering that the person beside him might become expensive. For Julian, the danger was not yet the passengers who could have flown on that aircraft. It was not the mechanics nearly blamed for a decision above them. It was liability. Headlines, canceled orders, investors. The possibility that the old man he stepped over would become the most credible person in the building. Before Julian could reshape the moment, the hangar doors opened. Helena Cross entered with 2 safety committee investigators and a legal observer. Helena did not move quickly, yet everyone made space for her. Authority looks different when it does not need to perform. Mara had sent her the inspection photo through a protected reporting channel minutes earlier, along with a note that Arthur's predicted sequence had been reproduced. Helena had spent years watching companies turn warnings into paperwork, and paperwork into delay. She knew enough to come in person. Julian tried to greet her with controlled surprise. He began explaining that the situation was complicated, that unauthorized access had disrupted the investigation, and that Mercer Aerotech was handling the matter internally. Helena listened with the patience of someone allowing a man to build his own trap out loud. Then she looked at the screen. The vibration trace remained displayed. The archived photo remained beside it. Rusk's approval line sat beneath the enlarged image. The open panel remained visible near the right wing. No speech could make those things disappear. Helena asked why the aircraft had been prepared for another test after repeated flight control lockouts. She asked why the vibration concern had not been elevated after the first week. She asked why a non-conforming bracket image had been marked, resolved without formal deviation documentation. She asked why the person who approved the refit had not disclosed the relevance of that approval during the troubleshooting investigation. Nobody answered quickly. That was answer enough. Julian tried to argue that grounding the aircraft without full executive review would create unnecessary panic and damage a major international sale. Helena told him that panic was not caused by grounding an unsafe aircraft. Panic was caused by pretending it was safe because the contract was large. The sentence landed like a verdict. She grounded the Meridian X7 immediately. No taxi test, no demonstration flight, no replacement of the hydraulic module until the right wing structure, bracket seat, feedback harness, and isolation valve were independently inspected. Helena Cross ordered all refit records preserved, all footage secured, and all personnel involved in the modification separated from the aircraft until formal statements were taken. The Meridian X7 was no longer a luxury product waiting for a buyer. It was evidence. Julian hated that word. Evidence meant the aircraft no longer belonged entirely to his schedule, his public relations team, or his money. Evidence meant order. Evidence meant timestamps. Evidence meant people who were used to being ignored could suddenly become witnesses. He tried to argue that the grounding was premature, that the foreign buyer would interpret it as instability, that the board would demand explanations, that investors would panic. But every objection made him look less like a leader protecting an aircraft and more like a man protecting a sale. Helena did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She reminded him that an aircraft with repeated control warnings, unexplained vibration traces, and a documented refit anomaly did not fly simply because a billionaire needed it to. The hangar listened to her because she spoke the way safety is supposed to sound. Calm, precise, and completely unmoved by pressure. Mara stood several feet away, still holding the printed inspection photo. Her hands had stopped trembling, but her face had not recovered. She knew she had crossed lines. She knew a canceled badge and an old corridor would not look clean in any official report. But she also knew what would have happened if she had gone back to her desk and let Rusk replace the hydraulic module first. The real fault would have been hidden beneath a false repair, and the next clean test might have become the most dangerous one. Helena seemed to understand that. She did not excuse the access breach, but she protected Mara as a reporting witness. That detail angered Julian almost as much as the grounding. He wanted someone punished quickly. Punishment could have helped him control the story. If Mara was reckless, then Arthur was a trespasser. If Arthur was a trespasser, then the evidence was contaminated. If the evidence was contaminated, then the aircraft could return to the language Julian preferred. Internal review, proprietary assessment, and temporary irregularity. Helena denied him that escape. Arthur listened without expression. He was not celebrating. His eyes remained on the aircraft. To him, the Meridian had not been fixed. It had only been heard. Men like Julian loved moments of public victory or defeat. Mechanics cared about what the machine would do tomorrow. A grounded aircraft was safer than a flying lie, but it was still a problem waiting to be understood completely. Dr. Rusk was placed on temporary administrative restriction pending review. He requested counsel almost immediately. He gathered his folder with careful hands and avoided looking at Arthur as he left the hangar floor. That avoidance told Arthur more than any confession could have. Rusk was not a man surprised by the evidence. He was a man surprised that evidence had survived. As the hangar began to clear, Helena approached Arthur. For the first time that day, someone with authority asked him who he was before deciding what he was. Arthur gave his name. Helena repeated it softly, and something shifted in her expression. She knew the name. Not from Mercer's current staff list, not from the borrowed badge on his jacket, but from an old aviation safety file that had never fully settled. Arthur Vale. Project Larkspur. The past, which Arthur had spent years trying to survive rather than explain, rose into the room. Helena asked whether he had worked on Larkspur 16 years earlier. Arthur confirmed it, but he did not offer the story. He had no desire to open that wound in front of Julian, Rusk's legal shadow, and half a hangar of people who had laughed at him before lunch. But Helena already understood enough. Years earlier, an independent review had questioned parts of the Larkspur finding, though the record had never been fully reopened because key raw data was missing and the original company had collapsed into asset transfers. Arthur's hand tightened around the toolbox handle. For 16 years, the official world had treated him as a concluded matter, a failed mechanic, a revoked license, a cautionary footnote. Now someone was saying the conclusion had been questioned, not in rumors, but in review. Did not feel like triumph. It felt like grief arriving late with documents in its hands. Mara looked from Helena to Arthur and understood that the old man's connection to the Meridian was deeper than instinct. The failure inside the modern jet was echoing the failure that had destroyed his life. Helena ordered her team to pull every Mercer archive connected to Larkspur-derived architecture. Julian objected immediately, using words like proprietary limits, acquisition complexity, and irrelevant history. Helena did not argue emotionally. She simply stated, that if Larkspur-derived systems appeared in the Meridian X7's control feedback design, then historical warnings were relevant to an active grounding. That ended the objection for the moment. But the real fight had only begun. Mercer Aerotech became quieter, and that quiet worried Mara more than shouting would have. The public relations team drafted careful language about a temporary safety pause. Legal counsel began separating documents into categories. Executives stopped speaking freely in hallways. Mechanics who had been ignored for weeks suddenly found their old notes requested by investigators. The hangar was no longer only a place where a jet had failed. It was a place where blame was being assigned, and everyone understood that powerful people would try to send it downward if they could. Arthur was taken to a glass conference room for a formal statement. The room had a long table, polished walls, and framed photographs of Mercer aircraft in perfect flight. Arthur sat at one end with his toolbox on the floor beside him. A security manager suggested removing it. Helena quietly told him not to. She may not have understood every tool in that box, but she understood enough to know that some objects are not weapons. They are the last proof of a life other people tried to erase. Mara sat nearby, pale but steady. She knew her job might not survive. She also knew that if Arthur had been right about the aircraft, then bringing him inside had not been recklessness. It had been the only reason the truth reached the panel before the false repair did. The questions began with what Arthur heard at the fence, what he predicted before the second test, what he saw in the refit photo, and what he found in the open panel. He did not exaggerate. He did not insult anyone. He described sequence, cause, and effect. That calm made his testimony stronger. Men who lie often decorate their stories. Arthur had spent a lifetime around machines, and machines punish decoration. One thing happens, then another thing happens. Because of it, the order matters. Then Julian's counsel asked about his revoked certification. There it was, the old stain placed carefully on the table. Arthur answered truthfully. His certification had been revoked after the Larkspur accident. He had appealed briefly, then stopped when his wife became ill, and the cost of fighting exceeded anything they had left. The official report blamed maintenance oversight, though Arthur had maintained from the beginning that the control feedback anomaly began before the event cited against him. Julian's counsel did not need to accuse him of anything new. The old accusation was useful enough. In corporate rooms, a damaged record can be used like smoke. It does not have to prove guilt. It only has to make people squint. Mara could not stay silent. She explained that Arthur identified the wing route before he entered the facility, before he accessed the records, before he opened the panel, and before anyone showed him the Larkspur reference. She explained that his warning about the hydraulic isolation valve came before the new warning appeared. She explained that the archived photo proved the shim existed long before Arthur was anywhere near the aircraft. Her voice shook at first, but facts steadied it. Julian accused her of emotional judgment. He suggested she had been manipulated by sympathy for a stranger. He reminded the room that she was not a mechanic, not an engineer, and not qualified to interpret aircraft systems. It was a cruel tactic because it dressed decency as incompetence. Arthur looked at him then. He did not raise his voice. He simply said that Mara had done what every safety manual claimed employees should do. She escalated a credible concern when the normal chain failed. If Mercer punished her for that, then the aircraft was not the only broken system in the building. For several seconds, no one spoke. Julian looked away first. That small movement did not restore Arthur's name. It did not fix the aircraft. It did not end the investigation, but everyone in the room felt the balance shift. The old man had not defended himself with anger. He had defended the person with less power. That is often how real character appears, not when victory is certain, but when punishment is still possible. By evening, the first version of the public story began leaking. Mercer's communications team tried to control it. They released a statement about an isolated configuration irregularity and a temporary safety review. They did not mention Arthur Vale. They did not mention the shim. They did not mention Julian's mockery at the fence or Rusk's attempt to turn the discovery into a sabotage concern. Companies often begin lying not by saying what is false, but by choosing which truths never enter the sentence. Then a financial news site published a harsher version, citing unnamed sources who claimed the Meridian investigation had been complicated by the involvement of a disgraced former mechanic tied to an old aviation accident. The article questioned Arthur's credibility. It described Mara's actions as unauthorized. It suggested internal experts were concerned about contamination, personal motives, and interference with proprietary systems. Arthur read the article on Mara's phone in silence. His name was once again attached to disgrace. For 16 years, he had lived under an official conclusion he could not afford to fight. The words were not new, but they cut differently now, because, for one day, he had allowed himself to believe truth might arrive cleanly. He should have known better. Truth often has to pass through mud before anyone admits it is water. Mara apologized, though she had not written the article. Arthur told her the company was doing what companies do when the witness is more dangerous than the failure. They could not yet defeat the evidence, so they were attacking the person who found it. But Julian had forgotten about his own cameras. Mercer Aerotech recorded nearly everything inside Hangar 12. The cameras had been installed to monitor workers, reduce liability, and protect company property. They recorded Arthur at the fence. They recorded Julian mocking him. They recorded the guards dragging him away. They recorded the tool spilling and the brass mirror sliding across the concrete. They recorded Arthur predicting the hydraulic warning before the second test. They recorded Rusk resisting the vibration trace, the archived photo on the screen, and the moment the room saw Rusk's approval line. The system designed to watch workers had watched the executives too. Mara knew where the safety archive copies were stored. Before her access could be fully restricted, she sent Helena the camera labels and timestamps through the protected reporting line. It was not a leak, it was preservation. There is a difference between exposing a company for entertainment and protecting evidence before powerful people can make it disappear. That night, Arthur returned to the small rented room above an old appliance repair shop where he lived. He had no real home in the way people meant the word. The room held a narrow bed, a hot plate, 2 shirts hanging from a pipe, old maintenance manuals, and a window that rattled whenever aircraft passed overhead. For years, the sound of planes had been both comfort and punishment. He could not stop listening to them, even after the world told him he no longer had the right to work on them. He placed the toolbox on the bed and opened it. The brass inspection mirror lay inside, scratched at the edges, its surface dulled by years of use. Arthur wiped it clean. In the mirror, he saw not only the tool, but the moment Julian stepped over it. He thought of Evelyn then, as he often did when a day wounded him more deeply than he wanted to admit. Evelyn had been the one person who never believed the official report. She had written letters, saved documents, and reminded him that losing a license did not mean losing the truth. Near the end of her illness, when Arthur had stopped fighting because medicine mattered more than lawyers. She told him that machines had always known who he was, even when men forgot. Arthur had not opened the storage box she left behind in years. Now he pulled it from the closet. Inside were old envelopes, faded photographs, unpaid medical notices he had never been able to throw away, and one small notebook wrapped in cloth. Arthur recognized it immediately. His shop notebook from the Larkspur years. He had thought it was lost. Maybe part of him had wanted to think that, because losing it hurt less than admitting he had been afraid to open the past. Between the pages, Evelyn had tucked a letter. Arthur unfolded it slowly. She had written it near the end, when her handwriting had begun to weaken, but her mind remained sharp. She told him that if the truth ever found him again, he should not turn away because of her. She knew he had chosen her care over the legal fight, and she did not want that choice to become another prison. She wrote that love was not the same as surrender. She wrote that if his name could still be restored someday, he should let it be restored. Arthur read the letter twice. For years, he had believed that choosing Evelyn over the appeal meant accepting the lie forever. Her words released him from a guilt he had carried so quietly that even he had stopped naming it. The dead cannot return what was stolen, but sometimes they can give the living permission to want it back. The notebook was rough, stained, and full of hand-drawn diagrams. It contained warnings about vibration-induced false feedback in lightweight control structures. It described dampening brackets, preload checks, harness clearance, and the danger of relying only on static testing when vibration was the real trigger. One phrase appeared more than once in Arthur's cramped handwriting. A bracket seated wrong can make the machine hear a ghost. The next morning, Helena's team found the first matching Larkspur file in Mercer's archive. It was an old technical memo, transferred during an acquisition years earlier. The memo described the same danger in cleaner language. It warned that a shimmed bracket could create a hidden path for vibration and make a control system believe a stabilizer had moved when it had not. Arthur read it in silence. The words were formal, but the thought beneath them was painfully familiar. Some of it had come from him. Years earlier, before the Larkspur accident, Arthur had written practical warnings after late-night tests. Engineers had laughed at his phrasing and then used the idea because it was right. After the accident, many of his notes disappeared from the official record. Now, similar warnings existed inside Mercer's archive without his name attached. Mara watched his face and understood the theft before he explained it. They had not only blamed him for failing to catch a danger he had warned them about. Somewhere along the chain, they had preserved his insight, stripped away his name, built new technology from it, ignored its limits, and then nearly blamed him again when the old danger returned. That kind of injustice is not merely professional. It is intimate. A man can steal your tool and leave you angry. But when they steal your warning, erase your name, and later punish you for recognizing the danger first, they are trying to decide who is allowed to speak reality itself. The first video clip appeared online later that day. It was short, shaky, and recorded by someone outside the service road. It showed Arthur being dragged from the fence while people inside the hangar laughed. The audio was poor, but Julian's posture was unmistakable. Viewers did not know the full story yet, but they saw enough to become curious. Why had a billionaire aviation CEO mocked an old man near a grounded jet? Why had the demonstration been canceled afterward? Why did the old man protect his toolbox like it held the last pieces of his life? Mercer's attempt to bury Arthur began to fail because curiosity does not obey press releases. Then the longer safety footage reached Helena's investigators. Within hours, the internal narrative collapsed further. The footage proved Arthur warned them before the new failure appeared. It proved Rusk resisted the test that confirmed the sequence. It proved Julian treated a safety warning as an insult because it came from the wrong kind of person. And when news of the archived photo spread inside the company, mechanics who had stayed silent began remembering things aloud. One refit technician admitted he had questioned the shim 6 months earlier. Another remembered being told the deviation was resolved above his level. Cal Benton submitted a statement acknowledging that workers had been trained, not formally but culturally, to stop writing concerns once leadership signaled impatience. None of them claimed innocence in a perfect way. That made their statements more believable. They had been afraid. They had been tired. They had survived by staying quiet. Now the aircraft had shown them what silence almost cost. Rusk was placed on formal suspension pending investigation. Julian did not defend him publicly. He began to distance himself with the speed of a man recognizing a sacrifice. He spoke of accountability, internal review, and his disappointment that critical information had not reached him clearly. But the cameras had already shown him ignoring the warning when it reached him in the plainest possible form. An old mechanic at the fence telling him where the fault lived. Rusk understood he was being prepared as the offering. That made him dangerous. Through counsel, he began producing emails showing the pressure Julian had placed on the Meridian team to maintain the demonstration schedule. None of the messages ordered anyone to install a shim or bury a warning. Men like Julian rarely write orders that way. They create conditions. They praise speed. They question delays. They make careers depend on impossible timelines, then act surprised when someone below them cuts a corner. Rusk's defense was not moral. It was survival. But survival has a way of dragging hidden truths into daylight. The two powerful men who had protected the same polished story began cutting each other with it. And then, late that night, Arthur received a phone call. The voice belonged to Raymond Sloan, a retired data analyst who had worked on the original Larkspur investigation. He was old now, thinner than Arthur remembered, his voice worn down by years of silence. Raymond said he had seen the news. He had seen Arthur's face. He had seen the phrase Project Larkspur return to public conversation. And for the first time in 16 years, silence felt heavier than fear. Arthur said nothing. Raymond continued anyway. During the original investigation, he had helped convert raw flight telemetry into simplified event timelines for the review board. The official summary blamed maintenance oversight. But the raw data, Raymond said, showed something different. The control feedback anomaly began before the maintenance event Arthur was blamed for failing to catch. In plain terms, the aircraft had started lying to itself before Arthur could have caused the chain they placed on him. Raymond had copied the raw data and hidden it. Fear had kept him silent. Guilt had kept him from destroying it. Arthur closed his eyes. For 16 years, he had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. He had imagined anger, shouting, relief, vindication. But when it came, he felt almost still. The body, after carrying pain long enough, sometimes receives impossible news, as if it is simply too tired to react. He did not forgive Raymond on that call. Forgiveness is not a switch old pain turns on because someone finally tells the truth. But he agreed to meet him because the data mattered more than the apology. The copy was held in a safe deposit box in Cincinnati under the name of Raymond's late sister. Helena arranged for an investigator to accompany them because chain of custody mattered now. The evidence had to be clean enough to survive the lawyers Julian Mercer could afford. Arthur traveled with Mara. In his jacket pocket, he carried Evelyn's letter. At his feet, as always, sat the blue toolbox. He did not need the tools for the meeting. He brought them because they were the only witnesses that had never left him. Raymond met them in a public library, older than Arthur remembered, bent inward by cowardice and regret. He did not ask for easy forgiveness. He explained what he had done, how the raw sequence differed from the summary, how his supervisor had pressured him to treat the anomaly as inconclusive, and how he convinced himself that reopening the matter would destroy his family without saving Arthur. Arthur listened. He saw a man who had failed him. He also saw a man finally bringing forward the one thing powerful people had kept hidden. Human beings, Arthur knew, were more complicated than machines. Machines fail according to conditions. People fail according to fear. At the bank, the safe deposit box contained an old data cartridge, a printed index, and a letter from Raymond explaining why he had preserved it. The cartridge looked too small to carry the weight placed upon it. But Arthur knew small things could change everything. A shim, a wire, a missing line of data, a truth kept alive in the dark. Helena's team extracted the telemetry with help from a specialist who could still read the obsolete format. The process took hours. Arthur waited in a small municipal aviation office with Mara beside him, staring at a framed picture of an aircraft lifting into a blue sky. He wondered how many beautiful machines had carried ugly secrets, because men on the ground were too proud to stop them. When Helena entered, she did not look triumphant. That told Arthur the truth had weight. The raw data confirmed Raymond's claim. The Larkspur control feedback anomaly began before the event cited against Arthur. The original report had not merely simplified the timeline, it had reversed its meaning. Arthur's maintenance oversight had been used as the clean explanation for a deeper design and vibration issue that management did not want to own. For 16 years, the report had treated him like the first failure in the chain. Now the machine from his past had finally spoken, and the report had reversed cause and effect. For years, Arthur had imagined that proof would feel like freedom. Instead, the first feeling was grief. He sat in the municipal aviation office with the raw telemetry summary on the table, and for several seconds, he could not move. The room around him seemed too clean for the truth it now contained. Fluorescent lights hummed above him. Mara sat beside him. Helena stood near the window with the expression of a woman who understood that official words could not return stolen years. Arthur thought of Evelyn. He saw her at the kitchen table, opening letters from agencies that never answered honestly. He saw the house they sold, when medical bills grew faster than hope. He saw the certification notice that ended the only work he had ever truly loved. He saw the faces of employers who read his record and became polite in the way people become polite when they have already decided no. He saw the apprentices he never trained, the aircraft he never signed off, and the nights when he woke, hearing alarms from a storm he had not caused. Proof did not give those years back. It only proved that the pain had been telling the truth. Mara placed her hand gently over his. This time, Arthur let it stay. Helena explained that the old Larkspur finding would not be overturned in a single afternoon. Institutions moved slowly, especially when admitting an old error meant admitting that real people had lived beneath it. But the evidence was now too strong to ignore. Arthur's notebook, Raymond's raw telemetry, the Mercer archive, Rusk's approval record, the Meridian X7 failure, the shimmed bracket, the rubbed harness, and the hangar footage all pointed in the same direction. A warning had been made. A warning had been buried. A system had been built from the buried warning. And when the same danger returned, the same kind of men had tried to bury the mechanic again. This time, they were too late. The deeper story broke the next morning. Nina Patel, an aviation safety journalist known for careful reporting rather than loud scandal, published the first full account. She did not write Arthur as a fairy tale hero or Julian as a simple villain. She explained the failure sequence, the physical evidence inside the right wing, the archived refit photo, the vibration trace, the Larkspur connection, Raymond's raw data, and the culture that allowed technical concerns to become inconvenient noise. Her headline described Arthur as the mechanic who heard the failure before the screens understood it. That line traveled everywhere. Pilots shared it. Mechanics shared it. Safety inspectors debated it. Aviation students began mapping the timeline. Ordinary people did not understand every detail of dampening brackets or feedback harnesses, but they understood the image of an old man at a fence, warning experts, being laughed away, and then being proven right by the very aircraft they said he had no right to approach. They understood Julian stepping over the mirror. That image became the symbol of the entire scandal. A billionaire stepping over the tool of the man who would save his aircraft. A company stepping over experience. An industry stepping over a warning because the person giving it looked poor, old, and inconvenient. Mercer Aerotech could no longer control the story. Julian tried it first. He released a statement praising the safety review and claiming the company had acted with caution once new information emerged. But the footage made those words look thin. The cameras showed Arthur's warning. They showed Julian's mockery. They showed the guards pulling him away. They showed Rusk resisting the simple test. They showed Julian objecting to the grounding because of the demonstration schedule. It was difficult to claim caution when the world had watched you treat caution like an insult. The buyer suspended the fleet order. Regulators demanded records. Investors demanded leadership accountability. The board, which had once celebrated Julian's speed and confidence, now spoke in colder words. Governance, risk, oversight, exposure. Men like Julian often discover too late that the people who praise arrogance during profit will rename it recklessness during crisis. Rusk fell first. Investigators recovered the private message he believed had disappeared. It had survived in an automatic backup attached to a project management export. In that message, Rusk had discouraged formal deviation language about the shimmed bracket because it could trigger structural review and create schedule exposure. The phrase was polite, corporate, and damning. It showed exactly how danger becomes paperwork when the wrong person is trying to protect a calendar. Rusk was terminated for cause and referred for regulatory investigation. His professional reputation, built on precision and authority, began cracking beneath his own words. He had spent his career sounding careful. Now everyone could see that careful language had been used to hide careless judgment. Julian tried to make Rusk the entire scandal. He described himself as misled by advanced systems leadership. He spoke of disappointment. He promised reform. He praised the employees who had helped identify the concern, carefully avoiding the fact that one of those employees had to bring Arthur through an unofficial route because the official chain had failed. But Rusk, facing ruin, refused to become the only sacrifice. Through counsel, he produced emails showing Julian's repeated pressure to keep the demonstration flight on schedule, despite unresolved modification concerns. None of the emails ordered anyone to commit misconduct in plain language. They did something more familiar and harder to prosecute. They created pressure. They rewarded speed. They punished delay. They made everyone understand what kind of truth leadership preferred. The two men who had once protected the same polished story began cutting each other with pieces of it. That was poetic justice, not because it was loud, but because it was exact. For years inside Mercer Aerotech, pressure had flowed downward. Executives demanded impossible timelines. Managers softened warnings. Mechanics carried the risk. Now the pressure flowed upward. The records used to control workers became evidence against executives. The cameras installed to monitor the hangar became witnesses against its owner. The old Larkspur files that erased Arthur's name became proof that his warning had outlived the people who stole it. While the powerful fought, the mechanics repaired the aircraft. The Meridian X7 remained grounded under independent oversight. Its right-wing panels were open, its harnesses were tagged, its bracket was removed. Its structure was lit by inspection lamps. Without the polished skin hiding its inner spaces, the aircraft looked less like a luxury object and more like what every aircraft truly is. A promise made out of metal, wire, pressure, tolerance, and trust. Arthur returned to Hangar 12 as an official technical witness. No one laughed this time. Cal Benton met him near the right-wing route. Shame sat plainly on the older mechanic's face. He had laughed at the fence. He had stayed quiet during the refit. He had survived in Mercer's culture by learning when not to challenge authority. Arthur did not demand an apology. He had little use for apology unless it changed what happened next. Cal understood that. He explained the repair plan with a humility that had not existed in the hangar before. The shim would be removed. The bracket seat would be restored and measured properly. The control feedback harness would be replaced and rerouted with correct clearance. The secondary hydraulic isolation valve would be inspected for stress from repeated false commands. The entire feedback loop would be recalibrated under staged vibration load, not only static conditions. Every aircraft that had received the same modification package would be inspected before returning to service. Arthur listened. He did not take over. He did not touch anything he was not authorized to touch. He had already been punished once by a world eager to blur technical truth with procedural accusation. This time, he remained careful. Licensed technicians performed the work. Arthur observed, asked questions, and gave advice only when invited. But everyone in the hangar felt the standard change around him. A young engineer asked whether the bracket preload should be verified again after the first vibration cycle, rather than only before panel closure. Arthur almost broke then. Not when Julian insulted him. Not when Rusk was exposed. Not when the raw data confirmed his old warning. But when a young engineer listened to his practical concern and wrote it down without making him prove that his experience deserved space on the page. Respect, when denied long enough, can feel almost unbearable when it finally returns. The repair took 2 days. They ran the vibration trace before closing the panel, then again after closing it, then again after the first controlled system cycle. The ghost signal did not return. The feedback channel stayed clean. The hydraulic isolation response remained stable. The bleed air spike vanished because it had never been the disease. It had only been the echo. On the final ground test, Hangar 12 filled with people in silence. The engine started. the sound rose smoothly through the space. Arthur stood several feet behind the main line with his toolbox at his feet, one hand resting lightly on the handle. He listened not for power, but for absence. The wrong pulse was gone. The right-wing root no longer carried that faint, false rhythm he had heard from outside the fence. The thrust increased through the range where the failure had always appeared. No stabilizer warning, no hydraulic dip, no thermal spike, no lockout. The Meridian X7 did not announce that it had been healed. It simply behaved. A quiet cheer moved through the hangar. Mechanics shook hands. Engineers exhaled. Mara covered her mouth with one hand. Cal looked down and wiped his face as if no one could see him. Helena watched Arthur, understanding that the moment belonged to him more than any press release would ever admit. Arthur did not smile broadly. His relief was deeper than expression. For the first time in 16 years, he had helped bring an aircraft back to truth in front of witnesses who could not erase him. The successful test did not save Julian. It made his position worse. If the aircraft had remained mysterious, he might have hidden behind complexity. But the fix proved Arthur had been right from the beginning. It proved the problem had not required weeks of executive theater, millions in unnecessary parts, or attacks on a poor old mechanic. It required opening the correct panel, respecting the first warning, and listening to someone who understood machines without needing permission from a billionaire. The board announced that Julian Mercer would step aside pending an independent governance review. They did not call it removal. Men with money often receive softer words on the way down than working people receive while falling. But everyone understood. Julian had built an empire on speed, image, and control. He lost control because a machine refused to carry his pride into the sky. Mara's suspension was lifted. More than that, Helena recommended her for a newly created protected escalation role, ensuring that non-engineering staff could raise safety concerns without being crushed by chain-of-command politics. Some executives called it an overcorrection. Helena called it overdue. Mara accepted, not because she wanted praise, but because she knew how close she had come to staying silent. She wanted the next person with a warning to have a better door than the one she had been forced to break open. The refit technicians who had raised concerns were cleared. Cal Benton submitted a statement, admitting that the hangar culture had trained workers to survive by becoming quiet. It was not an easy statement to write. It made him look weak in places, but it saved younger workers from carrying blame that belonged above them. And that was the first honest thing he had done in too long. Then came Arthur's hearing. The Aviation Authority reopened the Larkspur findings based on the raw telemetry, Raymond's testimony, Arthur's notebook, the Mercer archive, and the Meridian failure. It was not a grand courtroom moment. It was a modest regulatory office with a long table, cautious language, and people who understood that admitting an old mistake could embarrass institutions that preferred their past to remain settled. Arthur wore a dark jacket Mara helped him choose. He carried the toolbox anyway. No one asked him to. He brought it because some part of him needed the tools nearby when the world finally reconsidered the hands that had held them. Evelyn's letter rested in his inside pocket. Helena testified first about the Meridian failure and the Larkspur connection. Raymond testified next, older and shaken, explaining how the raw data had been reduced into a misleading summary and how fear kept him silent. Mara testified about the day at the fence, about Arthur's warning, about the decision to bring him inside, and about the way the aircraft proved the warning before the company accepted it. Cal submitted his statement, describing the repair and Arthur's diagnostic accuracy. Arthur spoke last. He did not ask the panel to pretend he had been perfect. He did not want a fairy tale. He wanted the sequence restored. He described the vibration concerns, the bracket preload warnings, the missing notes, the test night conditions, the raw data he requested but never received, and the official summary that placed cause after consequence and then called it truth. He spoke of Evelyn only briefly because grief was not evidence, but it was part of the cost. He explained that losing his certification had not only ended a job, it had removed him from the one language he had known since boyhood. The panel listened. Arthur had once spoken to rooms that were already closed against him. This room was not fully open, but it was no longer locked. When the questioning ended, the panel deliberated. Arthur waited in the hallway with Mara on one side and his toolbox on the floor beside his shoes. He did not pace. He had done enough waiting in his life to know that movement did not hurry judgment. Still, every minute carried the weight of 16 years. When the decision came, it arrived in careful language, as institutional truth often does. The original Larkspur finding would be amended. The agency acknowledged that the report had overemphasized maintenance oversight, while failing to properly account for vibration-induced control feedback anomalies that preceded the cited maintenance event. Arthur Vale's documented warnings would be added to the record. His professional standing would be restored for historical review purposes. His revoked certification, long expired under the original finding, would be reinstated in honorary status, with eligibility for supervised renewal if he chose to pursue it. The agency expressed regret. Regret. Such a small word for 16 years. Arthur lowered his head. Mara looked away to give him privacy. Helena did the same. Raymond covered his face at the far end of the hallway. Arthur thought of Evelyn, and grief arrived with gratitude tangled inside it. He wished she could have heard the decision. He wished it had come before the illness, before the house was gone, before shame became part of the air they breathed. But the truth had come at last. Late, wounded, imperfect, but real. And because it had come, the lie would not be the final thing written beside his name. Reporters waited outside the building. Some wanted anger. Some wanted revenge. Some wanted Arthur to condemn Julian, Rusk, the agency, and everyone who had failed him. But Arthur had spent enough of his life being used in other people's stories. He would not turn his pain into entertainment just because cameras had arrived. He spoke instead about listening. He said safety was not created by confidence. It was created by attention. It came from mechanics, technicians, inspectors, coordinators, and every person close enough to notice when something felt wrong. He reminded them that a machine does not care about titles, wealth, reputation, or pride. If a bracket is seated wrong, it is wrong. If a signal is false, it is false. If a warning comes from an old man at a fence, the warning does not become less true because the man's jacket is worn. That evening, the longer footage of Julian stepping over Arthur's fallen mirror was shown in a documentary segment about the Meridian scandal. The image became a symbol almost immediately. The public loved it because poetic justice is easier to understand when it fits in a single frame. Arthur saw something quieter. He saw the mirror. The next morning, he sat at the little table in his rented room and polished the brass inspection mirror with a soft cloth. Its surface was scratched. Its edges were worn. It did not reflect perfectly, but it reflected honestly enough. That had always been its purpose. It did not make hidden spaces beautiful. It made them visible. A week later, Mercer Aerotech invited Arthur back to Hangar 12. Not as a public relations ornament, though some people certainly wanted to use him that way. Helena made sure the invitation had substance. The company was creating a training program on practical fault recognition, safety escalation, and the danger of dismissing worker concerns. The young mechanics had asked for Arthur by name. He almost refused. The hangar still carried the echo of laughter. The fence, the guards, Julian's shoe stepping over the mirror, Rusk's sabotage accusation, all of it still lived there. But Mara reminded him that places do not become clean because good people leave them. They become clean when someone teaches the next generation not to repeat what happened there. Arthur returned. On his first morning as a training consultant, he stood beside an opened airframe in front of a group of apprentices. Some had degrees. Some had grease under their nails already. Some were young enough to believe modern diagnostics would catch every danger before human hands needed to. Arthur did not shame them for that. He opened his toolbox and placed the brass mirror on the bench. Then he placed Evelyn's letter beside it, folded closed, not for them to read, but for himself to remember why truth must be defended before people are forced to spend their lives proving they deserved it. He began with a simple lesson. A bracket can look seated and still be wrong. A harness can test clean and still lie under vibration. A screen can show symptoms without showing origin. A room full of experts can miss what one careful person hears, if the room has already decided who is worth listening to. The apprentices leaned forward. Arthur lifted the mirror and angled it into the dark space behind the training panel. In the small reflection, they saw what direct sight could not show. Hidden brackets, tight clearances, a road where vibration might travel. Nothing dramatic, nothing glowing red. Just the kind of ordinary place where danger waits when pride moves too fast. Arthur told them never to trust a closed panel simply because someone powerful was tired of waiting. Cal stood at the back of the room, listening. Mara stood near the door, now officially responsible for making sure warnings had a path. Helena watched from the corridor for a moment, then walked away without interrupting. The best reforms are not always announced. Sometimes they are practiced quietly until they become normal. Months passed. The Meridian X7 returned to service only after independent verification. Other aircraft touched by the same modification package were inspected. New reporting protections were created. Concern logs could no longer be buried by one executive's preference. Safety meetings began with uncomfortable questions instead of polished confidence. Julian disappeared from daily leadership. Rusk's case moved through regulators. Mercer Aerotech survived, but it did not survive unchanged. The company learned, painfully, that the cost of listening early is always smaller than the cost of being forced to listen later. Arthur never became rich. He did not want to. He did not move into a large house or become a celebrity expert with a glossy office. He kept a small room for a while, then accepted a modest apartment closer to the training facility because his knees were getting worse, and Mara insisted the stairs were trying to kill him. He complained about the move, but not very convincingly. On quiet evenings, he still heard aircraft pass overhead. The sound no longer punished him. Sometimes it reminded him of Evelyn. Sometimes it reminded him of the years that were gone. But sometimes, more often than before, it sounded like work still worth doing. One afternoon, after a training session, a young apprentice stayed behind. He was nervous, holding a report form in both hands. He told Arthur he had noticed a tiny vibration during a bench test, but he was not sure it meant anything. He was afraid of wasting everyone's time. Arthur looked at the form, then at the young man. For a moment, he saw himself decades earlier, standing in a room where his warning was treated as inconvenience. He saw the fence. He saw the mirror on the concrete. He saw Julian's polished shoe stepping over it. Then he looked at the apprentice and handed him a pen. He told him uncertainty was exactly where safety begins. The apprentice wrote the concern down. It turned out to be minor, a loose mount, easy to fix, no scandal, no headlines, no billionaire losing control in front of cameras. Just a small warning caught early, because someone had been taught not to stay silent. Arthur considered that one of the greatest victories of his life, because justice is not only when the powerful fall. Sometimes justice is when the next frightened person speaks sooner. Years later, people would still tell the story of the old mechanic at the fence. They would talk about the billionaire, the private jet, the hidden shim, the raw data, the exposed executive, and the mirror on the ground. They would call it unbelievable because people like stories where arrogance is punished and truth returns at the perfect moment. Arthur knew the truth was less perfect than that. Truth had come late. It had left scars. It had not saved Evelyn. It had not returned the house. It had not given him back the strength of his younger hands. But it had returned his name to him. It had changed a hangar. It had taught young workers that warnings do not become worthless because they come from someone without power. And maybe that was enough. On his final day of the first training cycle, Arthur stood inside Hangar 12 near the same fence where he had once been thrown out. The Meridian X7 rested in the distance, quiet and repaired. The brass mirror sat in his toolbox, scratched but clean. Mara joined him for a moment, and neither of them spoke at first. Outside the fence, the concrete looked ordinary. Arthur remembered kneeling there, gathering tools while rich men laughed. He remembered the mirror sliding through the dust. He remembered Julian stepping over it as if it were nothing. Then he looked back into the hangar, where apprentices were now teaching one another how to inspect the hidden places. Mara asked whether he ever got tired of telling the story. Arthur smiled faintly. He said the story was not about him. It was about the warning. Because every machine, every workplace, every family, every life gives warnings before it breaks. Sometimes those warnings come from screens, sometimes from numbers, sometimes from a sound no one else notices, and sometimes they come from a person the room has already decided not to respect. The danger is not only missing the warning. The danger is deciding who is allowed to give one. Arthur picked up his toolbox and turned from the fence. He walked back into Hangar 12 slowly, with the same worn jacket, the same tired knees, and the same careful hands. But he no longer walked like a man waiting to be removed. He walked like someone the truth had finally brought home. So if you ever see someone being dismissed because they look too old, too poor, too quiet, or too ordinary to matter, remember Arthur Vale. Remember the aircraft that warned them 3 times. Remember the billionaire who laughed. Remember the mirror on the concrete. And remember this: what you step over may be the very thing that could have saved you.
Step away from that Ferrari before I make this worse for you.
Malcolm Reed did not move an inch.
You already made it worse when you decided I could not own it.
His appearance told Vanessa everything she assumed.
A man like you does not arrive here in a car like that.
But Malcolm gave her one quiet warning.
Be very careful with the story you are about to tell.
Vanessa turned suspicion into a public accusation.
Someone call security! This man is trying to steal from my company.
The valet knew the truth was nearby.
Ma'am, I think you should look at the registration first.
Vanessa made sure he could not speak.
One more word, and you will lose this job tonight.
Malcolm protected him without raising his voice.
Do not punish him for telling the truth.
The truth is obvious. He does not belong beside a Ferrari.
The crowd watched Vanessa judge him openly. Still, Malcolm never looked afraid. Then police lights washed over the Ferrari.
Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Before you touch me, you may want to call your superiors.
But Malcolm's silence had a history. To understand why Malcolm Reed stood there so still while a woman tried to turn his life into a crime scene, you have to understand that he had survived far worse than being underestimated. He had built his entire life in rooms where people looked at him last, listened to him least, and then acted surprised when his ideas saved them. Malcolm had been born in a neighborhood where broken engines were more common than working streetlights, and where boys learned early that the world often noticed their mistakes faster than their talent. His father had driven buses for nearly 30 years. His mother cleaned offices and buildings where the executives never learned her name. But in their small garage behind the house, Malcolm found a language that did not care about status. Engines either worked or they did not. Metal either fit or it failed. A machine could be understood if a person had patience, discipline, and the humility to listen. As a child, Malcolm could not afford model cars, so he drew them. He sketched the curves of Italian sports cars from old magazines other people threw away. He studied the way light moved across the hood of a Ferrari, the way every line seemed to be a decision made by someone who understood speed as both science and poetry. But he did not love cars because they were expensive. He loved them because they were proof that imagination could become something real enough to touch. While other boys dreamed of owning a Ferrari, Malcolm dreamed of understanding why one existed at all. He wanted to know how beauty and engineering could meet in one object so perfectly that even a stranger on the sidewalk would stop breathing for half a second. That obsession carried him out of the neighborhood, through scholarships, late-night jobs, and years of being the only person in the room who looked like him. He became an engineer first, then a designer, then a businessman almost by accident. People who understood cars trusted him. People who understood numbers eventually had no choice but to respect him. But Malcolm never chased attention. Attention to him was a noisy room where people applauded before they understood the cost of what they were praising. He preferred quiet ownership. He preferred to build things and let others stand beneath the lights. It was a habit born partly from humility and partly from pain. The person who understood that pain best was his wife, Eleanor Reed. Eleanor had met Malcolm before anyone called him brilliant, before investors returned his calls, before his first company appeared in financial magazines. She had met him when he still carried engine grease under his fingernails and apology in his posture, as though the world had taught him to take up less space than he deserved. Eleanor never saw him that way. She saw the mind behind the quiet. She saw the patience behind the restraint. She saw a man who could walk past a showroom window and describe, from memory, how the car inside breathed. For years, Malcolm and Eleanor built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and extraordinary from within. She taught high school literature. He worked impossible hours in the automotive industry, first repairing what others broke, then designing systems that made luxury dealerships more efficient more honest, and more profitable. He believed the car business did not have to be built on arrogance. He believed that people buying a dream should not be cheated by those selling it. Eleanor believed in him so completely that when he hesitated to start his own company, she placed a notebook on the kitchen table and filled the first page with the name she thought belonged to his future. Reed Caldwell Automotive Group. Caldwell was not Malcolm's name. It belonged to Richard Caldwell, a charming investor with old money, perfect teeth, and the kind of confidence that opened doors before he knocked. Richard had the connections Malcolm lacked. Malcolm had the vision Richard could never have invented. Together, they launched what would eventually become Caldwell Prestige Motors, a chain of high-end dealerships known for rare European cars, white glove service, and a reputation so polished that wealthy customers trusted it before reading the contracts. In the early days, Malcolm believed partnership meant shared purpose. He learned later that some people use partnership as a polite word for taking what another person built. Richard Caldwell liked Malcolm's mind, but he did not like Malcolm's presence at the front of the company. Investors, Richard warned, were more comfortable with a familiar face. Clients, he suggested, expected a certain image. Malcolm heard the meaning beneath every careful phrase. He had heard it his whole life. So he stayed behind the curtain and built the systems, trained the staff, negotiated the supplier relationships, and designed the customer ethics policy that became the company's hidden strength. Richard smiled at ribbon cuttings. Malcolm made sure the lights stayed on. Then came the betrayal. It was not dramatic at first. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives as missing paperwork, delayed signatures, board meetings rescheduled without notice, legal language no one explains until it is too late. By the time Malcolm realized Richard had tried to push him out, the company was already wearing another man's name like a stolen suit. Eleanor wanted him to fight publicly. She wanted the world to know who had built the foundation beneath Caldwell's marble floors. Malcolm wanted justice too, but he also knew the cost of a public battle. He had seen what powerful men could do when they felt exposed. He chose a slower kind of justice, one that required patience, discipline, and the kind of silence most people mistake for surrender. With Eleanor's help, Malcolm protected what mattered. Through a private family trust, carefully structured before Richard understood what was happening, Malcolm retained controlling interest in the holding company behind Caldwell Prestige Motors. Richard kept the spotlight. Malcolm kept the keys. The arrangement was strange, but it worked. Malcolm stepped away from the public face of the company and built a private investment firm that quietly rescued businesses, funded scholarships, and supported young mechanics who reminded him of the boy he used to be. Richard Caldwell enjoyed fame until illness and debt consumed the last years of his life. After his death, the Caldwell name remained, but the real power never sat where outsiders thought it did. Eleanor was the only person who knew how much that silence had cost him. She knew that every time Malcolm entered one of his own dealerships and watched employees fail to recognize him, a small part of him had to choose peace over pride. She also knew he was not weak. He was waiting. Not waiting for revenge exactly, but for the right moment to turn ownership into protection. She used to tell him that wealth was only meaningful when it defended people who had none. Malcolm carried those words long after Eleanor became ill, long after hospital rooms replaced business meetings, long after the woman who had believed in him before the world did left him with more money than he wanted, and one promise he could not forget. The Ferrari came from that promise. Years before Eleanor died, She and Malcolm had walked past a private collection after a charity dinner. Inside, under warm museum lights, was a deep red Ferrari, 812 super fast, elegant and aggressive, a machine that seemed to be moving even while parked. Eleanor had smiled at the way Malcolm stopped talking mid-sentence. She had known he was not seeing status. He was seeing childhood, survival, and design brought together in one impossible shape. She had told him that one day, when he finally stopped hiding from the life he had earned, he should buy one in red, not because rich men did, but because the boy in the garage deserved to see his dream in color. Malcolm did not buy it while she was alive. During her illness, extravagance felt obscene. After her funeral, it felt empty. But on the first anniversary of her passing, he purchased the Ferrari through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust, not as a trophy, but as a memorial. He had her initials engraved inside the cabin, where only someone looking closely would notice. He drove it rarely, and only on days connected to purpose. The car was not a toy. It was a reminder that grief could travel with beauty, and that promises made in love did not expire when a heartbeat stopped. The night of the Meridian Auto Museum Gala was one of those days. Caldwell Prestige Motors was sponsoring the event, at least publicly, but the real money came from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The gala was meant to launch a scholarship program for underprivileged students entering automotive engineering and technical training. Malcolm had insisted the program focus not on polished applicants with perfect resumes, but on young people who had learned from broken engines, family sacrifice, and necessity. He wanted the scholarship to find the version of himself the world had nearly missed. Vanessa Caldwell had other priorities. She was not Richard Caldwell's daughter, though she allowed people to assume the connection when it helped her. She had married briefly into the extended Caldwell family, kept the name after the divorce, and built a career out of appearing indispensable to men who confused Polish with competence. Vanessa had been appointed interim CEO after a leadership scandal shook the company, and she treated the temporary position as though it were a throne. She understood luxury branding, media optics, and the social choreography of wealthy rooms. She did not understand loyalty. She did not understand craftsmanship. And she certainly did not understand the kind of quiet power that did not need to introduce itself. To Vanessa, Caldwell Prestige Motors was an image to be sold. She wanted to merge the company with a foreign luxury conglomerate that had no interest in Malcolm's ethics policies, scholarship commitments, or employee protections. The sale would have given Vanessa an enormous personal bonus and a permanent title in the new organization. It also would have gutted the foundation Malcolm had built. Customer service departments would be outsourced. Longtime mechanics would be dismissed. The scholarship fund would be renamed, reduced, and folded into a marketing campaign. Vanessa called it modernization. Malcolm saw it for what it was: extraction disguised as progress. For months, Malcolm had watched from a distance as reports crossed his desk. Customer complaints rose. Employees resigned. Warranty claims were delayed to improve quarterly numbers. A small transfer from the charity budget had been labeled as event preparation, then moved again through consulting fees. No single entry proved corruption by itself, but together they created a pattern. Malcolm had seen enough patterns in his life to know when a machine was beginning to fail. He did not rush. He asked his legal team to gather documents. He asked the board chair to observe quietly. And then he accepted the invitation to attend the Meridian Gala in person. He did not tell Vanessa he was coming. He did not ask for a reserved entrance. He did not request a security escort or a press announcement. He drove himself in the Ferrari because Eleanor would have laughed at the idea of him arriving in a chauffeured sedan to a scholarship created in her name. He wore a simple navy jacket, a white shirt, and the watch Eleanor had given him when their first company turned a profit. The watch was not flashy. Its value was sentimental, not obvious. That was how Malcolm preferred most things. At the museum, the evening was already glittering when he arrived. The building curved in glass and steel around a central hall filled with historic race cars, polished engines, and photographs of drivers who had risked everything for speed. Wealth moved through the room with practiced ease. Champagne glasses caught the light. Sponsors smiled for cameras. Young scholarship applicants stood near the edges, dressed in borrowed suits and careful dresses, trying not to look overwhelmed by a world that had rarely opened doors for them. Malcolm noticed them first. He always noticed the people standing at the edges. One of those young people was Jordan Ellis, a valet assigned to the front entrance for the evening. Jordan was 22, nervous, and trying hard to appear invisible. 3 years earlier, he had been one bad month away from dropping out of a technical training program when an anonymous grant paid his tuition balance. He never learned the donor's name, only that the grant came from a trust connected to automotive education. What Jordan did not know yet was that the man stepping out of the red Ferrari was the reason he had a uniform, a job, and a future still within reach. Jordan recognized the car before he recognized the man. Everyone did. The Ferrari seemed to gather attention as naturally as fire gathers heat. Malcolm handed over no performance, no boast, no demand for special treatment. He simply greeted Jordan with respect, asked whether the staff had been given a place to eat during the long event, and waited for the answer with the seriousness of someone who considered that question important. Jordan was so startled by the courtesy that it took him a moment to respond. Most guests treated valet workers as extensions of the curb. Malcolm treated him as a person whose comfort mattered. That small exchange might have passed unnoticed if Vanessa Caldwell had not been standing near the entrance, preparing for a photographer. She saw the Ferrari first, then Malcolm, then Jordan's uncertain expression. In the space of a few seconds, her mind arranged those details into the only story her prejudice could accept. The car was too rare. The man was too understated. The valet looked too nervous. And the gala was too important for her to risk embarrassment. Vanessa did not approach like a host welcoming a donor. She approached like a property owner finding a stranger near the silverware. Malcolm saw the change in her face before she spoke. He had seen it in boutiques, hotels, boardrooms, country clubs, and once in the lobby of a bank that held more of his money than the manager earned in a decade. It was the look of someone deciding that evidence was unnecessary because assumption felt more natural. Vanessa asked for proof before she asked for his name. She looked at his jacket, then at the Ferrari, then at the gathering crowd, as though she were protecting civilization from a clerical error. Malcolm could have ended the moment there. He could have given his full name, called the board chair, or let one of the wealthiest families in the city learn within seconds who he was. But he had not come to the gala to perform power. He had come to watch what Caldwell had become when it believed he was absent. So he did what he had done for most of his life. He stayed calm, offered the simplest truth, and watched carefully to see who would choose fairness when fairness was inconvenient. Vanessa failed that test almost immediately. Vanessa Caldwell had spent her career learning how to turn uncertainty into authority. She knew that in wealthy spaces, the person who sounded most offended often controlled the room. So when Malcolm Reed calmly explained that the Ferrari belonged to him, she treated his calmness not as evidence of innocence, but as arrogance. She insisted that the vehicle matched one recently serviced by Caldwell Prestige Motors, and because her company had sponsored the gala, she claimed a responsibility to protect its assets, its reputation, and its guests. The words sounded professional enough from a distance. Up close, they were something uglier, wearing a tailored suit. Malcolm listened without interruption. That made people uneasy. A guilty man, they expected, would panic. An innocent man, they assumed, would defend himself loudly. Malcolm did neither. He stood beside the Ferrari with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that raising his voice would only make certain people feel justified in fearing him. He removed the registration card from a leather folder and offered it to Vanessa. She glanced at it only long enough to dismiss it. The name on the paperwork did not satisfy her because it did not match the story she had already chosen. Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust meant nothing to her except another obstacle between her accusation and the public victory she wanted. The crowd grew thicker. Guests who had come to celebrate charity now lingered for scandal. A few recorded openly. Others pretended to check messages while angling their phones toward Malcolm's face. This was how humiliation multiplied in the modern world. It no longer needed a courtroom or a newspaper. It needed only a confident liar, a silent crowd, and a camera hungry enough to turn a human being into content before the truth had time to breathe. Jordan Ellis stood near the valet podium with his hands tight at his sides. He knew something was wrong. The man beside the Ferrari did not move like a thief. He had arrived openly, not in a rush. He had spoken kindly. He had known to ask about the staff meal, a detail no ordinary guest noticed. Most importantly, Jordan had seen the registration card. He had caught the name of the trust, and something about it stirred a memory from the tuition letter he had kept folded in a shoebox at home. The grant that saved his future had come from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The same words were on the card Vanessa had just refused to believe. Jordan wanted to speak, but fear trapped him. His supervisor had warned the valet staff before the event that Vanessa Caldwell did not tolerate embarrassment. Workers who caused trouble would not be invited back. For Jordan, losing this job meant more than missing a paycheck. It meant falling behind on rent, delaying certification, maybe returning to the same dead-end work he had fought to escape. He watched Vanessa sharpen her accusation, and shame burned in him because he understood how silence could become cooperation. Inside the museum, the gala continued without understanding that its true purpose was being threatened outside the doors. Young students stood near displays of vintage engines, while donors congratulated themselves for generosity. A large banner promised a new future for overlooked talent in automotive engineering. Malcolm had funded that banner. He had funded the scholarships, the mentorship program, and the equipment grants that would follow. Yet outside, the man whose money made the evening possible was being treated as the danger. Vanessa's suspicion quickly became performance. She reminded everyone within earshot that Caldwell Prestige Motors dealt in vehicles worth more than most homes and could not afford to ignore irregularities. She emphasized that the Ferrari was a rare model, that criminals often targeted events like this, and that responsible leadership required swift action. Every sentence made her sound less like a woman seeking truth and more like someone auditioning for applause. The fact that Malcolm remained composed only irritated her further. She needed him to look guilty. She needed fear in his eyes. She needed the crowd to see what she believed she saw. When museum security arrived, Vanessa did not present uncertainty. She presented conclusion. She described Malcolm as an unauthorized individual attempting to take control of a high-value vehicle connected to her company. The words were careful, polished, and poisonous. They avoided the crudeness of open prejudice while carrying the same conclusion. This man didn't belong here, and therefore his ownership must be impossible. Malcolm again offered documentation. Again, Vanessa's certainty moved faster than anyone's willingness to verify. Security asked Malcolm to step away from the vehicle. He did. That small act of cooperation seemed to disappoint the people waiting for drama. He did not reach into his pocket suddenly. He did not challenge them with anger. He simply stepped back, folded his hands, and asked that the documents be checked before anyone treated an assumption as fact. One guard looked embarrassed. Another looked toward Vanessa, as though her title mattered more than the paperwork in Malcolm's hand. That glance told Malcolm almost everything he needed to know about the culture she had created. Vanessa noticed it too. Power teaches some people to recognize hesitation and punish it before it becomes courage. She pressed harder, reminding the guards that the entire gala was under media coverage and that any delay could become a reputational disaster. What she did not mention was that she had already created the disaster. In her mind, reputation meant controlling how things looked, not whether they were right. The first police car arrived 10 minutes later. To the crowd, it felt like confirmation. People who had been unsure now adjusted their faces into expressions of concern. Police lights have a way of turning suspicion into a script, and once that script begins, many people stop asking who wrote it. Malcolm watched the officers approach. He had known this possibility from the moment Vanessa raised her voice. He had also known that his wealth, his documents, and his education might not protect him quickly enough if the wrong person decided that his calmness was defiance. The lead officer, Daniel Price, was not cruel in the theatrical way Vanessa was cruel. His danger was quieter. He arrived with the fatigue of a man who believed he had seen enough to trust shortcuts. Vanessa gave him her version first. She did it quickly, confidently, and with just enough corporate language to sound credible. She described the Ferrari as possibly stolen from company custody, Malcolm as evasive, and the registration paperwork as suspicious. By the time Malcolm was invited to explain, he was no longer a man beside his own car. He was a suspect, attempting to overcome a story already planted. Malcolm handed over his identification and the registration card. Officer Price studied them, then studied Malcolm, then looked at Vanessa. That sequence mattered. The documents should have been the center of gravity. Instead, the officer's eyes kept returning to the woman in the expensive dress, who seemed so certain. Malcolm recognized the old imbalance. Paper was supposed to speak equally for everyone, but in the real world, paper often needed a powerful person to read it honestly. Vanessa grew bolder when she sensed the officer's uncertainty. She claimed there had been internal alerts about inventory irregularities at a Caldwell service facility. That part was not entirely false, which made the lie more dangerous. There had been irregularities, but they were not caused by Malcolm. They were caused by Vanessa's own pressure on employees to move vehicles and records in ways that made quarterly reports look cleaner than they were. One of those records involved a Ferrari recently serviced under a trust account. Vanessa had seen the paperwork days earlier and ignored the owner's name because she was focused on something else, hiding the fact that charity funds and service charges had been shifted between accounts before the merger review. The Ferrari, in other words, was not evidence of Malcolm's crime. It was evidence of Vanessa's panic. But no one outside the museum knew that yet. All they saw was a black man being questioned beside a car they assumed belonged to someone richer, louder, and more expected. Officer Price asked Malcolm why he had come to the event. Malcolm explained that he had been invited. Vanessa challenged that immediately, claiming she had personally reviewed the VIP list and did not recall seeing his name. She made memory sound like proof. Malcolm did not argue. He simply provided the digital invitation stored on his phone. Vanessa leaned in, saw the donor access credential, and for the first time a flicker of concern crossed her face. It disappeared quickly, but Malcolm saw it. The credential did not list him as Malcolm Reed. It listed him under the name of the trust. That was by his own design. For years, he had preferred the work to be recognized, not the man behind it. But now the privacy that had protected his peace gave Vanessa room to attack him. She suggested the invitation could have been obtained improperly. She suggested the trust name could be used as cover. She suggested anything that kept her from admitting the simplest possibility, that she had been wrong from the beginning. A younger officer asked whether someone from Caldwell's headquarters could verify the service records. Vanessa answered before Malcolm could. She insisted that she was the highest-ranking Caldwell executive present, and that her judgment should be sufficient until the vehicle could be impounded. The word impounded moved through the crowd like a spark. Phones lifted higher. Jordan's face tightened. Malcolm looked toward the Ferrari, not because he feared losing it, but because the thought of that car being dragged away under suspicion felt like an insult to Eleanor's memory. He remembered the day the Ferrari arrived. He had stood alone in the delivery room, while the dealer representative explained features Malcolm already understood better than he did. The car had gleamed beneath the lights, but Malcolm had not touched the steering wheel right away. He had placed his hand on the seat beside him, imagining Eleanor there, teasing him for pretending not to be emotional. He had whispered nothing aloud. He had only breathed through grief and gratitude until both became too large to separate. Now Vanessa was turning that memory into evidence of theft, and the cruelty of it settled deeper than her words. Still, Malcolm remained calm. Not because he felt nothing, but because he felt too much to waste it on spectacle. He asked Officer Price to contact the registration authority, the insurer, and the attorney listed on the trust documents. He also asked that the vehicle not be touched until its ownership was verified. The requests were reasonable. Vanessa treated them as manipulation. She accused him of trying to delay accountability and warned the officers that sophisticated thieves often used paperwork to confuse law enforcement. That phrase pleased her. It made prejudice sound like expertise. The situation might have turned then if Jordan had found his courage sooner. He stepped forward halfway, then stopped when Vanessa's assistant, a thin man named Miles Voss, moved beside him and quietly reminded him that temporary staff were replaceable. Miles did not need to raise his voice. Fear does not require volume when the power imbalance is clear. Jordan swallowed what he knew and stepped back. Malcolm saw the exchange. He did not blame the young man. He had once been young enough to know how expensive courage could be. Inside the museum, The gala program was nearing the scholarship announcement. Vanessa was supposed to appear on stage in 15 minutes. She knew that if Malcolm was still outside, if police were still questioning him, if guests kept filming, the evening would become impossible to control. So she made the choice that revealed her more clearly than anything she had said. She urged the officers to remove him from the entrance before donors became uncomfortable. Not before the truth was verified. Not before paperwork was checked. Before donors became uncomfortable. That was the moment Malcolm understood that Vanessa had to be removed from Caldwell, not merely corrected. A person who valued donor comfort over human dignity could not be trusted with a scholarship fund built for overlooked students. A leader who saw humiliation as a branding problem could not protect employees who lacked power. Malcolm had come to observe. Vanessa had given him the answer. Officer Price asked Malcolm to place his hands where they could be seen while they sorted things out. The request was framed as procedure, but procedure can feel very different depending on whose body carries the risk. The crowd grew silent in the way crowds do when they know something wrong is happening, but want permission from authority before admitting it. Malcolm complied. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. He could feel Eleanor's initials inside the car behind him. He could feel old memories rising. The bank lobby, the hotel elevator, the showroom where a salesman once assumed he was the driver for someone else. Each memory carried the same message. Prove you belong. Prove you are not a threat. Prove you own what you built. Then Jordan finally moved. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. He stepped toward Officer Price with his hands trembling and explained that he had seen the registration card, that the trust name matched the scholarship donor materials, and that Malcolm had arrived as an invited guest. His voice shook, but truth does not need to be fearless to matter. Vanessa turned on him instantly. She accused him of interfering in a police matter and warned that his employment would be reviewed. The threat landed exactly where she aimed it. Jordan went pale, but he did not step back this time. That small act changed the air. One of the younger scholarship applicants inside the museum noticed the commotion through the glass. Then another. Soon, several students moved toward the entrance, drawn not by gossip, but by the uneasy recognition that the man outside looked more like their fathers, uncles, neighbors, and future selves than anyone on the gala stage. They had come to be celebrated by a company claiming to believe in overlooked talent. Now they were watching that company's acting CEO overlook truth in real time. Malcolm looked at Jordan with gratitude, but not surprise. Courage often begins as a whisper. He knew that. He also knew Vanessa would punish the young man if she survived the night with power intact. So Malcolm made one final request, this time not to the officer, but to the process itself. He asked that his attorney be contacted immediately and that the board chair of Caldwell Prestige Motors be informed that the trust's representative was being detained at the entrance of the event, funded by that same trust. Vanessa laughed at the phrase trust's representative, not loudly, but with enough contempt for those closest to hear. She thought Malcolm was dressing himself in legal language to escape consequence. She did not understand that he had just given her one last chance to pause before stepping over the edge. Officer Price, still unsure but increasingly aware that the situation was more complicated than Vanessa had claimed, allowed Malcolm to make a call. Malcolm did not call a friend to rescue him emotionally. He called Amina Pierce, the attorney who had protected his interests for 15 years and who had warned him that Vanessa Caldwell's ambition had finally become dangerous. He gave her only a few calm details: the museum entrance, the Ferrari, the attempted impound, the presence of police, and Vanessa's refusal to verify ownership. Amina did not need more. She had been waiting for the machine to expose its broken part. While they waited, Vanessa tried to reclaim control by moving the event forward. She instructed Miles to inform the stage manager that the scholarship announcement would be delayed due to a security issue. That phrase spread quickly through staff radios. Security issue. It sounded clean. It sounded neutral. It erased Malcolm's name, Vanessa's accusation, Jordan's courage, and the simple fact that the only danger present had been created by a woman who mistook her bias for leadership. Minutes passed. The crowd shifted. The police checked the license plate and found no stolen vehicle report. They checked Malcolm's identification and found no warrant, no record, no reason to restrain him. But Vanessa kept insisting that internal company records raised concern. She promised documentation from Caldwell's system, and Miles hurried to retrieve a tablet. When he returned, the record he showed listed the Ferrari as pending corporate hold. It looked official enough to confuse the officers. It was also false, altered that afternoon by someone using executive access. Malcolm saw the screen and understood. The accusation was no longer just prejudice. It was fraud being improvised in public. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Not into anger, not exactly, but into something colder. Disappointment, sharpened by certainty. Vanessa mistook it for fear and pressed forward, urging the officers to detain him until the discrepancy could be resolved. Officer Price reached for his cuffs, not with eagerness, but with the weary surrender of a man letting a flawed process carry him. Jordan stepped forward again, but a security guard blocked him. Several guests began recording closer. Vanessa's eyes brightened with victory. And in that suspended moment, as Malcolm Reed stood beside the Ferrari that carried his wife's initials, with one officer preparing to turn assumption into restraint, the glass doors of the museum opened behind the crowd. A woman in a gray suit entered with a leather case in one hand and the expression of someone who had not come to negotiate. Behind her walked Bernard Hayes, the board chair Vanessa had been trying to avoid for months, and Marisol Chen, Caldwell's chief financial officer, carrying a folder thick enough to end careers. Vanessa saw them and went still. Malcolm did not smile. He simply lowered his hands and waited for the truth to arrive. Amina Pierce did not need to raise her voice to take control of the entrance. Some people carry authority like jewelry, bright and decorative, meant to be noticed before it is useful. Amina carried it like a blade kept sharp in silence. She moved through the crowd without asking anyone to step aside, and still they did. Bernard Hayes followed with the exhausted look of a man who had ignored too many warning signs and was now watching them gather into proof. Marisol Chen kept her eyes on Vanessa, not with hatred, but with the clean sadness of someone who had finally confirmed what she had feared. Vanessa recovered first, or tried to. She spoke to Bernard as though this were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an uncooperative guest. She framed the police presence as a necessary precaution. She described Malcolm as evasive, the Ferrari as suspicious, and the altered company record as justification for every humiliating second that had passed. But her words no longer landed with the same force. Power depends on the room believing you are the highest authority present. Vanessa had just lost that illusion. Amina asked Officer Price to review the documents in her case before any further action was taken. This time, no one dismissed the paperwork. The first document established the Ferrari's ownership. The vehicle had been purchased legally, insured properly, and registered through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The VIN matched, the title matched, the insurance matched, the trust documents matched. There was no theft, no unauthorized possession, no legal basis for impoundment. The car belonged to the trust, and Malcolm Reed was its managing trustee. Officer Price's face changed as he read. It was not dramatic, but it was visible. The confidence he had borrowed from Vanessa drained away, leaving behind the discomfort of a man realizing he had nearly placed handcuffs on an innocent person because someone wealthy had sounded certain. He returned Malcolm's identification with a formality that could not repair the damage, but at least stopped it from growing. The younger officer looked relieved. The security guards looked away. Vanessa refused to surrender. She shifted from accusation to confusion, insisting that the internal Caldwell record still listed the car under corporate hold. Marisol Chen opened her folder. That was the moment Vanessa's fear became unmistakable. Marisol had spent weeks tracing irregular entries across Caldwell's systems. At first, she had believed the problem was sloppy management under pressure from the proposed merger. Then she found the charity transfers. Then, the delayed warranty reimbursements. Then, the executive overrides attached to vehicles used as collateral in internal reports. Finally, that afternoon, she saw the Ferrari record altered less than an hour before Malcolm arrived at the gala. The alteration had not been made by a clerk. It had been made through executive credentials assigned to Vanessa Caldwell's office. The crowd did not understand every technical detail, but they understood enough. They understood that the document Vanessa had used to justify suspicion had been changed from inside her own system. They understood that the man she had accused had shown real paperwork, while she had relied on a record that now looked manufactured. Most of all, they understood that the story they had been recording was not the one they thought. Their phones remained raised, but the mood behind them changed. Curiosity became recognition. Recognition became shame. Vanessa tried to blame Miles. Miles looked as though his soul had left him standing there with a tablet in his hands. For months, he had obeyed her, softened her threats into emails, arranged her meetings, and watched her treat fear as a management tool. Now, with police present and the board chair listening, loyalty became too expensive. He admitted that Vanessa had ordered him to pull the Ferrari's service history and flag it before the gala, claiming she needed leverage over an unnamed trust donor who might oppose the merger. He had not known she would turn that flag into a police accusation. That did not make him innocent, but it made the machinery visible. Bernard Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Malcolm watched him carefully. Bernard was not a villain, but cowardice in a boardroom can create space for villains to operate. He had allowed Vanessa's aggression because profits had risen. He had accepted her explanations because asking harder questions would have delayed the merger. He had told himself that leadership sometimes required sharp edges. Now those sharp edges had been turned on the very person whose trust kept Caldwell alive. Amina then presented the second set of documents. These were not about the Ferrari. They were about control. The Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust held the controlling interest in Reed Caldwell Holdings, the private entity that owned the majority of Caldwell Prestige Motors. Through that trust, Malcolm Reed possessed the authority Vanessa had spent months pretending she held without limits. He was not a random guest. He was not merely a donor. He was not an outsider trying to impress anyone with a sports car. He was the hidden founder, the principal owner, and the final vote on the merger Vanessa had built her future around. The silence that followed was deeper than the earlier silence. Earlier, people had been quiet because they were waiting to see a man punished. Now they were quiet because they understood. They had watched the owner of the company be treated like a criminal by his own acting CEO. Vanessa stared at Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time made the world unfair to her. That is the strange arrogance of people who judge too quickly. They are not horrified by the harm they caused. They are offended that the person they harmed turned out to have power. In her face, Malcolm saw no real remorse, only calculation collapsing. She was not thinking about the insult to his dignity. She was thinking about the merger bonus slipping away, the board votes dissolving, the headlines forming, and the video evidence spreading faster than her lawyers could contain it. Malcolm finally spoke, but even then, he did not perform anger for the crowd. He made it clear, in a measured way, that the issue had never been whether he could prove he owned the Ferrari. The issue was, what would have happened if he could not? What if he had been a mechanic, borrowing a customer's car with permission? What if he had been a young student from the scholarship program standing beside a vehicle he had been asked to move? What if he had been Jordan, or any worker whose documents were not enough to overcome a powerful person's assumption? Malcolm's calmness forced the crowd to confront the truth Vanessa had tried to hide behind procedure. The problem was not a misunderstanding. It was a system in which certain people were believed first, and others were forced to survive the consequences. Jordan stood near the valet podium, barely breathing. When Malcolm's eyes found him, the young man looked down, ashamed that he had hesitated. Malcolm did not let that shame settle. He acknowledged Jordan's courage in front of everyone, not as a dramatic reward, but as a correction. The first person at that entrance who had tried to protect the truth had not been a board member, an officer, or an executive. It had been a young valet with the most to lose. That fact embarrassed the powerful more than any speech could have. Vanessa attempted one last defense. She claimed she had acted out of concern for company property, but that argument collapsed under its own weight. Amina reminded the officers and the board that concern for property did not explain why Vanessa ignored valid registration, threatened a witness, pushed for impoundment before verification, or used an altered internal record. Marisol added the financial findings. Transfers from the scholarship event budget to consultant accounts tied to the merger campaign, delayed vendor payments hidden under administrative review, and pressure placed on employees who questioned the numbers. The Ferrari incident had exposed the pattern because Vanessa, in her haste to humiliate Malcolm, had reached for the same tools she used everywhere else: intimidation, optics, and manipulated records. Poetic justice does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives as a board chair asking for a badge to be surrendered. Bernard removed Vanessa as acting CEO on the spot, pending a formal investigation. The words were quiet, but they struck harder than any public insult she had thrown at Malcolm. The title she had used as a weapon disappeared in front of the same crowd she had tried to impress. Her access to company systems was suspended. The merger vote was postponed indefinitely. The police opened a separate inquiry into the altered record, and the charity fund she had treated as a branding tool was placed under independent protection by the trust she had mocked. Vanessa's face hardened as she realized there would be no graceful exit. Minutes earlier, she had wanted Malcolm removed from the entrance, so donors would not feel uncomfortable. Now donors watched as she was escorted away from the gala she had planned to dominate. She had accused Malcolm of not belonging beside the Ferrari. In the end, she was the one who no longer belonged in the building. The same cameras she had welcomed for publicity captured her fall. The same crowd she had tried to command stepped back from her, as though arrogance itself had become contagious. Malcolm did not celebrate. That disappointed some people watching, but it revealed the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge would have demanded humiliation equal to the humiliation Vanessa had attempted. Justice required something more difficult and more lasting. Malcolm wanted the company repaired. He wanted the scholarship protected. He wanted employees free from fear. He wanted the students inside the museum to remember the night, not only as the night a powerful woman was exposed, but as the night a promise survived. The gala did not end. That was Malcolm's decision. Vanessa's removal created chaos, but Malcolm refused to let her failure become the students' punishment. After a delay, the guests were invited back into the main hall. The mood had changed completely. The champagne seemed less important. The speeches sounded thinner. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of charity now carried the uncomfortable knowledge that charity without dignity is only decoration. When Malcolm entered the hall, he did not enter like a conquering hero. He entered slowly, with Jordan beside him and Amina a few steps behind. The red Ferrari remained outside under the lights, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but of everything people had failed to see. Inside the museum, the scholarship applicants watched him with a different kind of attention. Earlier, some had wondered whether they belonged in such a polished room. Now they had seen the man who funded the room nearly thrown out of it. The lesson was painful, but it was also powerful. Belonging, they learned, is not always granted by the people guarding the door. Bernard Hayes took the stage first and admitted, with visible difficulty, that the evening's program had nearly been overshadowed by a failure of leadership. He did not reveal every legal detail, but he acknowledged enough for the room to understand that an apology was owed. Then Malcolm was introduced properly, not as a mysterious donor, not as a trust representative, but as the founder whose principles had shaped Caldwell before ambition distorted them. Some guests applauded too quickly, eager to move from discomfort to redemption. Malcolm let the applause fade before the room could use it to absolve itself. He did not give them the speech they expected. He did not describe his net worth. He did not tell a triumphant story about proving people wrong. Instead, he spoke about Eleanor. He spoke about a woman who believed talent often lives where opportunity refuses to look. He spoke about young mechanics who learn precision from necessity, about students who work night shifts before morning classes, about parents who sacrifice quietly so their children can build something better. He made the room understand that the scholarship was not a public relations gesture. It was a debt paid forward. As he spoke, the meaning of the Ferrari changed again. It was no longer merely a luxury car or even evidence in a public accusation. It became part of a love story. Malcolm explained, without turning grief into spectacle, that the car carried Eleanor's initials because she had taught him to honor the dreams he once felt embarrassed to admit. She had believed that a boy from a forgotten garage could one day own beauty without apologizing for it. The room grew still, Not with scandal this time, but with tenderness. Even those who had recorded his humiliation lowered their phones. The scholarship recipients were announced one by one. Jordan was not on the original list because he had already received support through the technical grant program years earlier. But by the end of the evening, Malcolm expanded the initiative. A new fellowship would be created for working students already inside the automotive industry, young people balancing jobs, training, and family obligations. Jordan would become its first mentor trainee, with full tuition support, paid certification leave, and a permanent position in Caldwell's technical development program if he chose it. The announcement was not charity tossed at him for good behavior. It was recognition of what courage had revealed. In the weeks that followed, the video spread far beyond the city. At first, people shared the most dramatic clip. Vanessa accusing Malcolm, the police lights flashing against the Ferrari, the moment Amina arrived with documents. But as longer footage emerged, the conversation changed. Viewers noticed Jordan trying to speak. They noticed Malcolm offering paperwork again and again. They noticed how quickly the crowd believed suspicion when it was spoken by someone expensive. The story became bigger than a Ferrari, bigger than a CEO losing her title, bigger even than one man's vindication. It became a mirror. Caldwell Prestige Motors underwent a reckoning. Malcolm did not burn the company down. He rebuilt its foundation in public. The proposed merger was canceled. An independent audit confirmed misuse of event funds and improper manipulation of internal records. Vanessa faced civil claims, regulatory scrutiny, and the permanent collapse of the image she had curated so carefully. Miles cooperated with investigators and was dismissed from his role. Bernard Hayes resigned from the board after admitting that oversight had failed under his leadership. Marisol Chen was appointed interim president, not because she was flawless, but because she had chosen the truth when silence would have protected her career. The company changed in ways that mattered. Employees received a protected channel for reporting misconduct. Valet workers, porters, mechanics, and junior staff were included in dignity and escalation policies that were not just printed in handbooks, but enforced. Customer contracts were rewritten in plain language. Warranty claims were reviewed. The scholarship fund was expanded and placed under a separate board that included educators, technicians, and former recipients. Malcolm insisted that the people most often ignored by luxury businesses should have a voice in how those businesses measured integrity. As for the Ferrari, Malcolm kept driving it, but not often. He brought it to the museum once each year for the scholarship ceremony, parking it not behind velvet ropes, but near the student entrance, where young people could see it up close. He allowed them to ask questions about the engine, the design, the balance between power and control. He loved those questions because they came from curiosity, not envy. He wanted them to understand that beauty did not belong only to those born near it. It could be studied, built, earned, and honored. 1 year after the incident, a small plaque was installed at the Meridian Auto Museum beside the scholarship wall. It bore Eleanor Reed's name, Malcolm Reed's name, and a sentence simple enough to be remembered by everyone who passed it. It said that dignity is the first door opportunity must open. Malcolm stood before that plaque for a long time after the ceremony ended. No cameras surrounded him then. No crowd demanded a reaction. Jordan, now wearing a technician's jacket instead of a valet uniform, stood nearby and said nothing, because some moments are too full for speech. Malcolm thought about the night Vanessa tried to reduce him to a suspect beside his own car. He thought about the officers, the crowd, the phones, the silence. He thought about how close the truth had come to being delayed by confidence, title, and assumption. He knew that his wealth had helped protect him. His attorney had arrived. His documents had been recognized. His ownership had been too large to ignore. But he also knew that many people never get that kind of rescue. Their truth is smaller on paper, easier to dismiss, and less profitable for strangers to defend. That knowledge kept him humble. It also kept him working. Vanessa eventually faded from headlines, though consequences followed her longer than attention did. She tried to rebuild her reputation through carefully worded statements about stress, misunderstanding, and procedural confusion. But the public had seen too much. More importantly, investigators had seen enough. The world she had built out of image could not survive contact with evidence. For a woman who had valued reputation above character, the punishment was brutally fitting. She had spent years polishing a name while neglecting the truth beneath it. In the end, the name tarnished exactly where the truth had been ignored. Malcolm never said he forgave her publicly. He also never let bitterness become his legacy. Eleanor had taught him that justice should protect the future, not merely punish the past. So he chose to build. He built scholarships. He built protections. He built a company where a young worker could challenge an executive without risking everything. He built the kind of door he wished had opened more easily when he was young. And the red Ferrari remained what it had always been, no matter what Vanessa tried to make it. Not proof of arrogance, not an invitation to envy, not a symbol that one man had become better than anyone else. It was a promise kept. It was a reminder that a boy who once fixed engines under weak garage lights had lived long enough to honor the woman who believed in him. It was also a warning to anyone who judged ownership by appearance, intelligence by accent, dignity by clothing, or worth by the comfort of their assumptions. Because sometimes the quiet man beside the car is not lost. Sometimes he is not lucky. Sometimes he's not trying to impress anyone at all. Sometimes he is the one who built the road, paid for the lights, opened the doors, and still waits patiently to see who will treat him with respect before they know his name. So the next time you see someone standing where you do not expect them to stand, pause before you turn your assumption into a sentence over their life. The truth does not become smaller because it arrives quietly. Dignity does not disappear because someone powerful refuses to recognize it. And kindness, when protected by courage, can outlast arrogance every single time. If this story reminded you that no one should have to prove their humanity before being treated with respect, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell us in the comments whether you think Malcolm gave Vanessa exactly the justice she deserved.